You know that feeling when someone's already decided what you're capable of before you've had the chance to show them otherwise? When quiet confidence gets mistaken for carelessness, and being doubted feels heavier than the task itself. Today's story is about someone who understood that some kinds of proof don't need an audience at all. What happens next isn't what anyone in that field expected. Here's where it begins. There was a smell that reached the cornfield before the clouds did that August afternoon, a wet, mineral smell riding low on the wind, and every man working the rows in Oakridge County knew exactly what it meant. The engine noise cutting out mid-row was what made them look up. A boy climbed down from the cab first, boots hitting dry soil, sleeves already rolled to the elbow. He did not look afraid. He looked like someone doing math in his head. Behind him, an older man leaning against the combine's rear tire watched without moving, arms folded, waiting to see what the kid would do. Neither of them said a word yet. The field itself seemed to be holding its breath. Hours earlier, before any of that had happened, the morning had started the way most late August mornings start on the Marsh place, quiet and gray at the edges, the yard light still burning weakly against a sky not yet decided on its color. Cody was up before 5, same as always during harvest, pulling on boots still stiff with yesterday's dust. The kitchen smelled like coffee and burnt toast, his mother's radio murmuring low from the counter, tuned to a station that mostly played static this far out from town. Roy sat at the table already dressed for the day, a mug in one hand, a folded grain report in the other, reading numbers he'd probably already memorized. "Storm's supposed to hold off till evening," Roy said, not looking up. "We pushed the Westfield today. Get ahead of it." Cody nodded, poured himself coffee he didn't really want, just for something to do with his hands. Out the kitchen window, the 4440 sat waiting in the yard, hitched to the picker from the night before, dew beating silver along its hood in the gray early light. He'd checked the oil himself 2 nights ago, topped off the coolant, tightened the loose hose clamp he'd noticed rattling on the way in from the far field. Small things. The kind of attention nobody noticed until the day they mattered. By the time Pete's truck rolled up the gravel drive a little after 6, Cody was already out by the shed, running a rag along the tractor's dash, more out of habit than necessity. Pete climbed out slow, coffee thermos in one hand, looked. The boy over the way, he looked over most things before deciding what to make of them. "You checked the fuel level?" Pete asked, not quite friendly, not quite unfriendly either. Just a question a man asks when he's used to checking things himself and isn't sure yet whether he trusts someone else's word for it. "Topped off yesterday evening," Cody said. "Should run the whole day without needing more." Pete grunted something that could have been approval or could have simply been acknowledgement that he'd heard the answer. He didn't say much else. That was Pete's way most mornings, a man who measured his words out carefully, like he only had so many to spend in a day and didn't intend to waste them on a 17-year-old before the sun was even fully up. Roy came out a few minutes later, work gloves already on, and the three of them fell into the easy rhythm of a morning that had happened 100 times before this one. Roy took the truck to check the far fence line first, same as every harvest morning, leaving Cody and Pete to start the picker moving through the east rows while the dew was still burning off. They worked steady through the morning, the machine chewing through row after row of ripe corn, the sun climbing higher and hotter with every passing hour. Around noon, they broke for a quick lunch in the shade of the grain shed, Pete eating in near silence the way he always did, Cody flipping idly through a tattered manual for a different tractor entirely, one he'd found in a box at an estate auction the spring before, the kind of reading most boys his age would have found unbearably dull. "You actually read that stuff for fun?" Pete asked at one point, not quite mocking but close to it. "Figure the more I understand how they're built," Cody said, "the less I have to guess when something goes wrong." Pete didn't respond to that, just chewed his sandwich and looked out at the field like the conversation had already ended somewhere neither of them had noticed. Pete finished his sandwich in silence, wiped his hands on his jeans, and leaned back against the shed wall, looking out at the field with the particular squint of a man calculating hours of daylight against acres left standing. "Your daddy know you spend your evenings reading about other men's tractors?" he asked, not unkindly, just curious in his own guarded way. "He's the one who gave you the box," Cody said. Said an auction like that only comes around once every few years. Told me most of what's worth knowing about a machine you won't find written down anywhere at all. But he figured the manuals were a start. Pete didn't say anything to that for a while. He just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's filing something away without deciding yet what to do with it. Overhead, the sky had shifted slightly since morning, the first thin gray streaks, now visible far off to the west, still hours away by anyone's guess. It was the kind of exchange that seemed to mean nothing at the time. Neither of them yet knew how much it would matter before the day was through. By early afternoon, they'd moved on to the west field, the last uncut section of the whole property, same as Roy had planned that morning at the kitchen table. The corn stood tall and heavy there, ready and waiting, every ear worth real money once it made it safely into the grain bins. The sky to the west had turned the color of wet ash by 4 o'clock. Roy Marsh's cornfield stretched flat and gold under it, row after row heavy with ears ready for the picker, the last uncut section swaying in a wind that smelled like rain 2 hours out, maybe less. Late August in this part of Oakridge County always ran on borrowed time. Everyone who farmed here knew the storms that rolled down out of the northwest in the final weeks of harvest didn't announce themselves gently. They arrived fast, dumped hard, and left standing corn flattened and rotting in the mud behind them. The John Deere 4440, a 1978 model that had outlived 2 hired men, 1 flood, and more repairs than anyone in the family cared to count, had been pulling the picker steady all afternoon. Its deep diesel growl was as familiar to Cody Marsh as his own heartbeat. He'd grown up falling asleep some nights to the sound of it idling in the shed, his father tinkering under a work light long after supper. Then, without warning, the engine bucked. Twice, coughed something ugly and mechanical from deep in its chest, and died. The silence that followed was the kind that made a farm feel very large and very empty at once. Even the wind seemed to pause. 17-year-old Cody sat in the cab for 1 second too long, listening to nothing at all, the kind of nothing that has weight to it. His father, Roy, was already gone, driving the last full load of corn to the grain elevator in town. 40 minutes each way on a good day, longer if the gravel road had washed soft anywhere from the last rain. Cell service out past the county line was more rumor than fact most afternoons. There was no calling him back, and no way of knowing exactly when he'd return. 40 minutes away, at the grain elevator on the edge of town, Roy stood in line behind 2 other trucks, watching the same gray sky through the windshield with a farmer's particular brand of worry, the kind that counts hours instead of minutes. He'd left the field with plenty of time to spare, or so he'd thought that morning. Now, watching the clouds thicken over the elevator's tin roof, he found himself tapping the steering wheel, doing the same math every farmer in the county was doing that afternoon. Distance. Time. Zen. He had no way of knowing. Waiting in that slow-moving line with his radio picking up nothing but static, that back at the Westfield his son was about to be tested in a way no one had planned for. That left Cody and Pete Larkin, the seasonal hired hand, alone in a field with a dead machine and a storm closing in. Pete was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, weathered by 3 decades of farm work across 2 counties, the kind of man who trusted almost nothing he hadn't fixed himself with his own 2 hands. He'd worked for the Marsh family every harvest season for going on 6 years now, dependable and quiet, never one to waste words on a job that spoke for itself. He had a rule about boys and machinery, one he'd never said aloud, but that everyone who'd worked alongside him understood within a week of meeting him. Machines were not toys, and 17 was not old enough to be trusted with anything that mattered. 200 acres of ripe corn stood behind that dead engine now, and the rain was already close enough to smell, sharp and metallic on the wind. Pete climbed down slow from the combine, boots landing heavy in the dry dirt, and spat once before reaching for the phone clipped to his belt. Dealer in the valley might send someone, he said, mostly to himself, thumb already scrolling toward a number he knew by memory. Hour and a half out, if we're lucky. Storm beats them here, this crop's done. Cody was already moving before Pete finished the sentence. He swung down from the cab, boots hitting the ground hard, and walked straight toward the engine housing without waiting to be asked. "I can look at it," he said. It wasn't a question. It was simply a fact he was laying down between them, plain and unhurried. Pete didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch first, the way older men sometimes do when they've already made up their minds and don't see much point in arguing. He leaned his heavy shoulders back against the combine tire, crossed his thick forearms over his chest, and watched. There was no shouting in that look, no raised voice, no lecture about staying out of grown men's business. Just a slow, deliberate stillness, heavier somehow than any argument could have been. A smear of grease still marked Cody's cheek from that morning's oil change, dried dark against his sunburned skin. To Pete, that single detail seemed to say everything he needed to know about who was standing in front of him. Somewhere behind the tree line, thunder rolled low and unhurried, like something clearing its throat before it finally decided to speak. Cody didn't wait for permission that wasn't coming. He walked to the tractor, popped the tilted engine hood the 4440 was known for, and the smell of hot metal and diesel rose up to meet him, sharp and familiar as his own hands after a long day's work. He checked the fuel gauge first, the way his father had taught him to check first before touching anything else. Nearly empty, right up until the fill up that morning. That small detail mattered more than it looked. An engine that runs dry doesn't simply need more fuel poured back into it. It swallows air along with whatever fuel remains, and that air gets trapped deep inside the lines, invisible and patient, waiting to cause trouble. A mechanical diesel engine like this one, with no modern electronics to compensate, has absolutely no patience for air where fuel is supposed to be. The injection pump can't build the pressure it needs through a pocket of trapped air. No pressure means no ignition. No ignition means no engine, no picker, and no crop coming in before the rain arrived to ruin it. Cody had watched his father bleed a fuel line exactly twice in his life. Both times, Roy had narrated each motion under his breath like a man reciting something he didn't want to get wrong. The words half for Cody's benefit and half simply habit. Cody had listened both times, quiet and attentive, the way he listened to most things his father said without appearing to be listening at all. He hadn't known, back then, that he was quietly memorizing something he'd need one day, alone in a field, with a storm rolling in and a man standing behind him who didn't believe he was capable of pulling it off. He reached into the cab, pulled out the wrench set from the metal toolbox behind the seat, the handles worn smooth from years of use, and got to work without another word. 90 seconds in, and already the first real test of patience arrived. The bleed screw on the primary fuel filter sat low and awkward, half hidden behind a bracket that hadn't been designed with easy hands in mind, tucked in tight against the block where sunlight barely reached. Cody's fingers found it anyway, feeling their way more than seeing clearly. He turned it slow, hunting for that exact point of resistance his father always talked about, the invisible line between loose enough and too tight. Too loose, and fuel sprays out uselessly, wasted on a dry dirt that could use every drop saved. Too tight, and you strip the threads clean out of old, soft metal, turning a 20-minute fix into a ruined afternoon for an entirely different reason. Behind him, Pete shifted his weight, but said nothing at all. The silence between them had taken on a shape of its own by now, heavy and specific, pressing down, harder than the thunder rolling steadily closer with every passing minute. Cody found the primer pump next, a small rubber bulb built directly into the fuel line for exactly this kind of trouble, designed decades ago by engineers who understood that even the best machines sometimes needed a human hand to coax them back to life. He began pressing it in slow, even strokes, counting silently under his breath, watching the bleed screw closely for the very first hiss of trapped air finally working its way free. Nothing came out of the first 10 pumps but fuel, thin and steady, no air at all yet. He adjusted the screw a careful quarter turn, feeling metal shift against metal beneath his fingertips, patient as a man waiting on weather he had no power to control or hurry along. There's a kind of work that refuses to be rushed, no matter how heavy the sky above it gets, no matter how loudly the clock seems to be ticking somewhere just out of sight. An old diesel engine has a temperament not so different from the men who've spent their whole lives working around machines like it out here in Oakridge County. It does not answer to panic, and it never once rewards a hurried hand, no matter how urgent the reason behind that hurry might be. Force the bleed screw too hard in a moment of nerves, and you tear the threads clean out of soft old metal, ruining in one careless second what patience alone could have saved in 5 quiet, unremarkable minutes. Rush the primer pump instead of trusting the process, and the air bubbles only tangle deeper into the line, further from freedom instead of closer to it. Roy had told his son once, without much ceremony, sitting on an upturned bucket in the shed one winter evening, that mastering a tractor was never really about commanding 300 horsepower from beneath a boot. It was about learning to hear the smallest hiss of air escaping between grease-stained fingers, a sound most men in a hurry were simply too impatient to ever notice at all. How many things in life get missed entirely? Cody found himself wondering as he worked, simply because nobody stayed quiet long enough to listen for the small sound hiding underneath the big, loud. Problem? Respect the way a machine wants to be handled, treat it with the patience it deserves, and sooner or later, more often than not, it answers back with loyalty. The wind shifted again, colder now, carrying the first real edge of the coming storm across the open field. Cody kept working, unbothered, or at least appearing unbothered, which out here amounted to nearly the same thing. He moved next to the second bleed point, located at the secondary fuel filter, and repeated the same slow, deliberate ritual all over again. Loosen the screw carefully. Pump the primer bulb in steady rhythm. Watch closely. Wait for the sound that meant something inside the line was finally beginning to give way. A faint hiss answered him this time, thin and quiet, almost too small to fully trust at first. He held perfectly still, listening harder than he had listened to anything at all that entire summer. There was again, unmistakable now, tiny bubbles of trapped air, escaping in a small, steady rhythm that meant the fuel line was finally starting to clear itself of the blockage holding the whole engine hostage. Pete uncrossed his thick arms for the first time since climbing down from the combine. He didn't move any closer to the tractor. He didn't say a single word, but something in the set of his broad shoulders had shifted, just slightly, the way a man's posture sometimes changes when a bet he'd already quietly placed in his own mind starts looking a good deal less certain than it did 5 minutes earlier. Cody climbed back into the cab and turned the key, half expecting nothing, hoping for everything. The engine groaned, caught for half a hopeful second, sputtered weakly, and died again, falling silent just as quickly as it had stirred. He didn't flinch, and he didn't waste time being disappointed. A false start wasn't failure. It was information his father always said, just another piece of the puzzle telling you where to look next. He climbed back down and crouched beside the engine block again, running his fingers along the length of the high-pressure line, feeling for anything loose, anything that shouldn't be there. Rain had started falling harder now, fat drops, darkening his shirt across the shoulders, but he barely registered it. His whole attention had narrowed down to the small, stubborn problem in front of him, the way it always did once his hands were actually inside a machine instead of just thinking about one. He remembered something else his father had said once, almost offhand, about the 4440's fuel system being notorious among old mechanics for holding a second, smaller pocket of air further down the line than most people thought to check. Most men gave up after bleeding the first 2 points, assumed the job was done, and wondered later why the engine ran rough for the first mile. Roy had learned that the hard way years before Cody was even born, and had passed a lesson down the same way he passed down most things, quietly, without making a lesson out of it at the time. Cody moved now, wrench already in hand, onto the high-pressure line at injector number 3, the one his father always called the stubborn one, the one that never gave up its secrets easily. He loosened the fitting one careful notch at a time, felt warm diesel spray thin against his knuckles, mixing there with the sweat already gathering on his skin from the humid, storm-heavy air. 10 more careful strokes on the primer pump. Slow, even, unhurried, no matter how loudly the thunder cracked overhead now. Thunder cracked closer, no longer simply clearing its throat somewhere in the distance, but announcing itself outright, unmistakable and close. The first scattered drops of rain hit the dry dirt around the tractor's massive rear tires, dark coins spreading fast across pale, thirsty ground. Cody wiped his hands once against his jeans, leaving dark streaks of oil behind, and climbed back into the cab for the second time that afternoon. He turned the key. The engine shuddered hard, coughed one thick puff of black smoke straight up from the exhaust stack, and then, unmistakably, settled into that low, steady, six-cylinder rhythm every farm kid across the county could have recognized blindfolded. Pat, 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 pat. Even and sure, patient and true, like something that had simply been waiting its whole stubborn life to be listened to. Properly. There was no cheering, no fists thrown triumphantly into the air. Cody climbed down slowly, wiped his blackened hands on a grease-stained rag, pulled from his back pocket, and looked out across the darkening field the way a man checks the time, not the way anyone celebrates a hard-won victory. Pete watched the engine idle steady for a long, quiet moment, saying absolutely nothing at all. Then, without a word, he bent down, picked up the wrench that had fallen forgotten in the grass beside the tractor, and set it back carefully into Cody's open toolbox. No praise followed it. No apology, either. He simply climbed back up onto the combine and returned to work, as if the last 20 tense minutes had been nothing more than an ordinary pause between two ordinary tasks on an ordinary afternoon. Cody understood that particular silence better than any speech Pete could possibly have given him instead. Out here, in a place like this, some men only ever had one way of admitting they'd been wrong about someone. This, quiet and wordless as it was, happened to be Pete's way of doing exactly that. The picker started moving again through the last standing rows of corn, the old 4,440 pulling steady and sure behind it, exactly as it had done for 15 faithful years before this one afternoon had nearly ended its work early. Rain began falling harder by the minute now, but the corn kept coming steadily anyway, ear after ear, filling the wagon load by patient load, while the sky finally let go of everything it had been holding back tight all day long. The last full wagon rolled into the grain shed just as the real storm finally arrived in earnest, rain hammering hard against the tin roof in a rhythm that sounded, strangely, almost like applause after everything that had happened out in that field. Inside the shed, the air smelled warm and close, thick with dry straw and fresh corn dust, a welcome contrast to the cold rain drumming steadily just outside. Cody sat down heavily on the worn wooden step at the shed's entrance, exhausted in that particular way that only comes from work done right under pressure that actually mattered. A can of soda sweated cold and slick in his clothes were streaked black with engine oil from collar to cuff, his knuckles still stinging faintly where the diesel had sprayed him earlier that afternoon. Headlights swept slow across the muddy yard. Roy's truck pulled in through the rain, tires hissing softly against wet gravel as it rolled to a stop near the shed. He stepped down into the falling rain, looked first toward the open shed doors, and saw the 4440 parked neat and quiet inside, the faint smell of warm exhaust still clinging to the damp evening air around it. He didn't ask what had happened to it. He didn't need to. He looked over instead toward the far corner of the shed, where Pete stood quietly wiping down a tool with an old rag, and caught the older man give one small, silent nod in Cody's direction. That single gesture was answer enough for a man who rarely needed more than that from anyone. Roy crossed the muddy yard without hurrying, peeling off one soaked leather glove as he walked, unbothered by the rain still falling steady around him. He didn't ask his son if he was all right. He didn't tell him he'd done a good job, either, the way some fathers might have rushed to say. Some things between a father and a son out here in Oakridge County never seemed to need saying out loud at all, not when actions had already spoken plainly enough. He simply reached down, set one broad, calloused hand firmly on Cody's shoulder, and gave it a single steady squeeze, warm despite the cold rain still dripping steadily from his sleeve onto the wooden step between them. Then he sat down beside his son on that same step, saying nothing more, content simply to be there. Pete finished stacking the last of the tools along the shed wall and walked past them toward his truck, pausing just long enough to glance back once at the tractor idling quiet in its stall. He didn't say anything to Cody directly, not that evening. But the next morning, when he pulled into the yard same as always, he tossed the boy a fuel filter wrench without a word of explanation, the kind of man only hands over to someone he trusts to use it right. Cody caught it out of the air and understood exactly what it meant better than any speech could have said it. Roy hadn't asked for details that evening, and he didn't ask the next morning either, or the morning after that. But word travels quiet and steady through a county like Oakridge, farmer to farmer over fence lines and feed store counters, and within a week most everyone who mattered had heard some version of what happened out in the Marsh's west field the day the storm nearly beat them to the harvest. Nobody made a big show of it. Out here, that wasn't how respect got handed around. It got handed around the way Pete had done it, quiet and plain, a tool passed from one set of hands to another without needing to say why. The two of them stayed like that a long while, watching autumn rain fall steady and endless across a field that had, against every reasonable odds stacked against it that afternoon, been fully harvested before the storm ever got the chance to take it away. Somewhere out past the distant tree line, thunder rolled on, softer now, more distant with every passing minute, already moving off towards some other farm's evening trouble. Inside the shed, the rain kept its own quiet, patient rhythm on the tin roof high above them, steady as a heartbeat, steady as an old engine that had finally learned, once again, to trust the hands that knew exactly how to listen. Where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever had to prove yourself to someone standing right behind you, without saying a single word in your own defense, the way Cody did that afternoon with the storm closing in? Tell us about it below. We read every single one. See you in the next story.